After the wedding, they were expected to stay here for a few more days before heading back home. But no, they all went off on their honeymoon without even telling me. Just as I was about to share my decision with them, everyone was gone. When I woke up 2 days later, after their wedding, I realized they had left, leaving me completely alone. I decided to call since many of their belongings were still at my place. But guess what? Nobody answered. For hours, I kept worrying, anxiously dialing over and over again. I was desperate to contact them, especially because I'd planned to inform them about my choice that very same day. Finally, at lunchtime, Julia picked up. Nonchalantly, she told me they had all left for their honeymoon and wouldn't be back for a week. A week? I was stunned. How could they just leave like that? Even if I wasn't part of their plans, the least they could have done was tell me before disappearing. I didn't want to sound petty, but I felt hurt, insulted, even that they hadn't bothered to ask me or inform me. I started questioning her about why none of this was communicated to me. Her excuse? Pathetic. She mumbled something about forgetting to inform me, then promised they'd return soon. That wasn't the point. I tried to explain calmly that my problem wasn't their absence, it was their rudeness. Leaving without saying goodbye or even acknowledging me was just plain impolite. But then, her tone shifted. When I mentioned I wanted to speak to my dad, she claimed he was too busy to talk to me. Too busy? Really? Still, I kept my cool and politely asked her to let me know when he had some free time so I could speak with him directly. Instead of agreeing, she completely changed her demeanor. Her kindness vanished, replaced by something cold and almost cruel. She told me not to worry them and said my dad would be busy for the next few days. Then, she accused me of being hysterical, just because they left me behind. As if that wasn't enough, she went on to lecture me. "You're not a child anymore," she snapped. "You need to accept that your dad has a new family now." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. She didn't stop there. She told me to quit thinking about myself and even suggested I should tidy the house for them before they returned. Who did she think she was? I wasn't going to let her talk to me like that. Before I could even respond, she hung up on me. Hung up. I was furious. I couldn't believe this was the same person my dad had chosen to marry. At that moment, I silently thanked the universe for helping me see the truth. I realized I could never accept my dad's offer. I decided not to call him again. Let them be. They weren't going to live with me anyway, so I packed up everything they owned, haphazardly, of course. I crammed their belongings into a few shabby cardboard boxes and dumped them in the yard for them to find when they decided to come back. After all, those things didn't belong to me, and they had no place in my house. I didn't care what happened to them after that. I carried on with my life, trying to ignore the betrayal I felt because of my dad's thoughtless actions. Yesterday, they finally returned from their honeymoon. Lucky for me, they found their stuff sitting in the yard while I was at work. Oh, and I replaced the locks too. No way were they getting back inside. When my dad called me about it, he was furious. He had the audacity to tell me they hadn't done anything wrong, claiming that leaving me alone without warning wasn't something to be upset about. Seriously? He accused me of being a spoiled child and said I was overreacting. I calmly told him to grab his boxes and leave. I also warned him that if I saw them on my property, I'd call the police. I didn't have time to waste worrying about this nonsense. I had to get back to work. By the time I came home, they had taken their things and left. That, it seemed, was the end of it. Or so I thought. The worst part came later. My dad called me at midnight, saying Julia wanted to talk to me. She started with an apology. How convenient. She retracted everything she'd said and claimed she regretted how she'd spoken to me. She insisted she didn't want us to stay on bad terms over something so trivial and asked for a second chance to make things right. But I wasn't buying it. I cut her off, told her to stop talking, and made it clear that I wouldn't let them live with me. If she truly regretted her actions, she wouldn't have waited so long to apologize. She could have done it during their vacation or immediately after our heated phone call. And my dad? I doubt he regrets anything either. He just tried to play the nostalgia card, saying he wanted to live in this house because it reminded him of my mother. Oh, and he even offered to split all the expenses, as if that would change my mind. I allowed him to explain himself when he called, claiming that he only wanted to feel closer to my mother by living in the house. He said it would be self-centered of me to throw them out like this without considering the consequences. He even tried to defend Julia's actions, insisting she'd just had a rough day and hadn't meant anything she said. Then he played another card, saying his girls missed me and wanted to come back to start fresh. But I couldn't accept any of it. Since the divorce, I'd known my dad had his eye on this house. And after seeing Julia's true colors, I wasn't willing to take any chances. I told him firmly that my decision wouldn't change. They couldn't come back. Suddenly, my dad broke down in tears over the phone. He accused me of being the most self-centered daughter ever, all because I wouldn't let him live in the home where he had the greatest days of his life. He said I was being petty and harsh over what he dismissed as a minor argument with Julia. Worse, he downplayed everything, saying the fact that they hadn't invited me on their honeymoon wasn't even worth mentioning. Then he crossed the line. He said my mother would despise this ugly side of me. Despise me? After his wife mistreated me? After they didn't even think to include me in their plans? And yet, I was the bad one for not letting them move in? I shared my story, but the responses weren't what I had hoped for. I understand what people were trying to say, but some comments were unnecessarily harsh. My dad doesn't deserve the defense some of you gave him. I stuck to my decision and didn't let him move back in. I've had enough rudeness in my life, and I don't need more. That's all he's been recently, rude and dismissive. Sure, he and Julia were sweet to me at first, and for a while, it was nice. But his true colors showed when I told him I needed more time to think. They must have run out of patience and thought they could pressure or guilt me into letting them stay. But I'm not weak. Being alone is far better than surrounding myself with the wrong people. Honestly, I should have known from the beginning. The way my dad reacted when he realized the house deed had been transferred to me, not him, should have been enough. It showed how materialistic and self-centered people can be when it comes to things like this. Looking back, I regret ever letting them in at all. As for Julia, I'm relieved she showed her true self and that her pointless arguments only ended up hurting her in the end. If things had gone differently, maybe we could have been a happy family, or at least something close to it. But after the way she spoke to me, I know that will never happen. I've learned my lesson and won't fall for their deceptive tactics again. I've been alone for so long. All my grandparents have passed, and I miss my mother terribly. I needed a family to lean on, but it's clear they're not capable of being that for me. Thankfully, I realized this before it was too late. Since they left a few days ago, my dad has been calling me constantly. He's even been texting me because I don't answer his calls. He thinks I should give them one final chance to make amends, but they don't deserve it. They squandered their one and only opportunity, and I know they'd do the same if I gave them another. It's not worth the risk because it would hurt me far more than anyone else. I admit I feel some regret about how I treated my dad, but in this situation, there's nothing more I can do. He never put much effort into our relationship, and as they say, you reap what you sow. He did nothing for me, so he has no right to expect me to base my life decisions on him or his feelings. It turns out my dad is desperate to move in, not just insisting. And guess what? He lost his job a few months before the wedding. He's been living off his savings ever since. The vacation he claimed to have taken? That was a lie. He had a decent amount of money saved, but after throwing an extravagant wedding and honeymoon, he's now broke. He finally admitted to Julia that they couldn't afford to return to Houston to try their luck there. With no job and no funds to cover rent, they're stuck. Julia can't help either because she quit her job to become a housewife after meeting my dad. Now my dad expects me to let them live with me. But Julia? She didn't even bother apologizing because she didn't know about any of this until my dad came clean. I was right. She never had genuine regret for her actions. She's fake. Through and through. Honestly, my dad deserves someone like her. Today, he contacted me again. This time, he asked if I'd let them move in for just a few days, just until he could find a decent job to support them. But I refused. I told him I wasn't going to do it. I don't need that kind of negativity in my life. They've been nothing but nasty to me, and he's an adult. He should have realized that blowing money on a lavish wedding and honeymoon was irresponsible. If my dad didn't have a job, I can understand the desire to flaunt wealth, but only for those who can actually afford it. Not for someone with 2 teenage stepdaughters and a housewife to support. His decision to ignore his responsibilities isn't my fault, even if he was fully aware of them. I'm not going to feel guilty for prioritizing myself. This situation is no longer my problem. They'll have to deal with it on their own. When I contacted him, I tried to be more polite than I'm being here. I didn't want it to seem like I was mocking him or making light of the situation. I told him the same things I've written here, but he chose to interpret it as sarcasm. He even said I'd be held accountable for how I'd treated him. I didn't respond. What's the point? No matter what I say, he'll find a way to twist it and blame me. It's better to stay quiet and let him deal with the mess he created. At this point, I barely care anymore. Today, my dad decided to leave the city. You'd think he'd just go quietly, but of course, that's not who he and Julia are. They turned it into a spectacle, making sure to inform me of my supposed failings as a daughter before they left. We hadn't spoken in weeks. After our last conversation, he didn't even try to reach out. But today, both he and Julia texted me. They seemed overjoyed to share their news. Julia's ex-boyfriend had agreed to pay for their return trip and even offered to let them stay with him. Apparently, her ex had some kind of epiphany and decided it was time to reconnect with his daughters. Though he'd been paying child support all along, he'd never made time for them before. Now, after waiting long enough for my dad and Julia to clean up their own mess, he decided to step in and handle it himself. I suppose this is great news for Julia's daughters. At least some fathers take responsibility, even if it's years too late. I can't help but feel that this was the only solution all along. But, of course, they didn't share any of this with me until today. A few hours ago, they sent me a photo of the girls along with a message that included a 4-leaf clover emoji and a Lucky Charm comment. I'm not naive. I can easily guess the real reason for Julia's ex's sudden change of heart. I'm not entirely sure why Julia's ex would pay for all their airline tickets, but I suspect her manipulative nature might have played a role. I've seen that side of her before, so I have no doubt she knows how to twist situations to her advantage. Honestly, I'm just glad they're leaving. This is the last time I'll have to deal with them. Reading other people's stories about their chaotic families has made me realize how lucky I am. My dad knows I won't hesitate to call the police, so he's too worried about his reputation to try anything against me. There's nothing to fear anymore, and I've learned how to defend myself. With them gone, I feel even less reason to dwell on the past. For me? Hooray! Sure, I still get lonely sometimes, but instead of moping, I've started reaching out to my friends. It's healthier, and honestly, it feels good to lean on people who genuinely care. After my mom passed, I shut myself off from the world, and it wasn't until I read those comments that I realized just how isolated I'd become. Now, I'm determined to live my life to the fullest. It'll take time, but I'm trying. Compared to many people my age, I feel fortunate. I have a steady job, a good salary, and a house of my own. I owe so much to my mom for setting me up with a strong foundation. Really, what more could a person want? I've got amazing friends who care about me, and I know if things ever go wrong, I can always turn to this incredible community for support. Today, out of the blue, my dad called me. He's been trying to contact me nonstop, calls, messages, even social media, but I'd been ignoring him. Still, his persistence finally wore me down. I answered, partly out of curiosity, partly to get him to stop. We hadn't spoken in months, and I figured this conversation would be, well, fascinating. And it was. He told me Julia had reconciled with her ex, the same man who paid for their return trip. Hearing this after all this time left me stunned. Apparently, things didn't work out with my dad the way she had hoped, so she decided to go back to her former relationship. My dad was distraught, shocked. He begged me for a chance to make amends, to rebuild our relationship. He even apologized for everything that had happened and seemed sincere. But you know what? After everything they put me through, I just couldn't muster any interest. The worry and pain their actions caused were too much. I couldn't let them back into my life. I told him I was sorry, but firm in my decision. Despite the desperation in his voice, I stood my ground. My mental health and well-being come first now. Since then, he's been trying to reach me again, but I've blocked his calls and messages. I know this is hard for him, but it's what I need to do to protect myself. That's it for now. Thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more shocking real-life stories.